Old Hollywood is often remembered as a world of diamonds, fur coats, and champagne-filled nights. But behind the gold-trimmed studio gates, a surprising number of stars lived the opposite way. Quiet, modest, and almost shockingly frugal. Why? Many of them had come from nothing. They'd survived the Great Depression. They knew the sting of poverty, the fear of a missed meal, the danger of excess. Fame was a flickering flame, and they didn't trust it to last. For these stars, living simply wasn't just about saving money. It was a kind of armor, a way to stay grounded in a world built on illusion. They wore old shoes, drove plain cars, and invested rather than splurged. They never forgot where they came from. In this countdown, we reveal 20 stars who proved that humility can shine brighter than gold. Starting with the legend who turned laughter into legacy and still counted every penny. Charlie Chaplin, the silent star who saved every penny. Charlie Chaplin knew poverty better than anyone in Hollywood. Born in the slums of London, he grew up in workhouses, begged for food, and lost his father to alcoholism. By the time he became the highest-paid actor in the world, Chaplin had already learned one hard truth: money disappears fast. Despite earning millions from hits like The Kid, 1921, and Modern Times, 1936, Chaplin never embraced the flashy lifestyle. He dressed modestly, avoided wild parties, and invested in land and gold instead of designer goods. Even his wardrobe was understated, and he preferred long walks alone over the company of elites. "A day without laughter is a day wasted," he said. But he never wasted money. For Chaplin, simplicity wasn't just a habit, it was a survival skill, and it stayed with him until the very end. Buster Keaton, a comedian haunted by bankruptcy. Buster Keaton was one of the biggest stars of the silent era. His physical comedy, stone-faced expressions, and daredevil stunts in films like The General, 1926, made him a legend. But fame didn't protect him from ruin. After a bad divorce and exploitative studio contracts, Keaton went bankrupt in the 1930s. The man who once earned fortunes was reduced to working behind the scenes, sometimes for pennies. Even when his career made a quiet comeback, Keaton never returned to luxury. He lived in a modest home, wore second-hand suits, and drove a beat-up old car. He raised chickens in his backyard and found joy in poker nights with friends. To the end, Keaton lived like the silent clown he once played, humble, quiet, and deeply human. Katharine Hepburn, the queen of plain living. Katharine Hepburn was always different. While other actresses bathed in diamonds and studio dinners, she chose old slacks, worn shoes, and life in a weathered Connecticut cottage. Born into privilege, she still despised waste. Hepburn cooked her own meals, avoided publicity, and wore the same clothes for years. She didn't own flashy cars or hire a large staff. For her, luxury was privacy and freedom. "I never lose sight of the fact that just being is fun," she once said. Her life, free from clutter, reflected that perfectly. Even at the height of her fame with films like The African Queen, 1951, she remained shockingly grounded, a woman who believed authenticity was more precious than pearls. Fred Astaire, the dance legend who never flaunted it. Fred Astaire made elegance look effortless, but offstage, the world's most graceful dancer lived with quiet restraint. He never liked grand parties. He didn't collect cars or live in mansions. Instead, Astaire enjoyed small dinners, modest homes, and a low-key life that few fans ever saw. Having struggled early in his career, he never took wealth for granted. Despite hits like Top Hat, 1935, and Swing Time, 1936, he preferred substance over show. "Do it big, do it right, and do it with style," he said, but that didn't mean doing it expensively. Fred Astaire lived like a man who had nothing to prove, and that's what made him a class act to the very end. Greta Garbo, Hollywood's mysterious recluse. While the rest of Hollywood was busy posing for cameras and basking in fame, Greta Garbo walked alone, literally. Often spotted wandering the streets of New York City in the same well-worn trench coat, sunglasses shielding her face, Garbo rejected the very machine that had made her famous. She had more money than most could imagine, millions from iconic films like Grand Hotel and Camille, but she never flaunted a cent of it. Garbo refused interviews, avoided parties, and ignored all invitations to return to Hollywood. She was done with the game. After retiring in her mid-30s, she lived in a modest Manhattan apartment and rarely left her neighborhood. The woman once dubbed the Divine Garbo became a living ghost, someone who had everything but chose almost nothing. She had wealth, but what she really valued was silence. And in her silence, she found something most stars never did: peace. And in that spirit of quiet dignity, we move to a man who also shunned glitz in favor of stillness, a war hero, and Hollywood's most understated leading man. James Stewart, the actor who preferred the simple life. Jimmy Stewart didn't just play the everyman, he was the everyman. One of the most respected actors of his generation, Stewart walked away from stardom more than once to serve his country. As a decorated bomber pilot in World War II, he saw real darkness, and it forever changed the way he saw the bright lights of Hollywood. After the war, Stewart returned to the screen in films like It's a Wonderful Life and Vertigo, but never embraced the celebrity lifestyle. While his peers built sprawling estates, Stewart lived in the same modest Beverly Hills home for over 50 years. He wore old suits, drove a station wagon, and dined at local diners. People often said Stewart seemed too normal to be a star, but maybe that was his secret. Maybe that's why he endured. He once said, "I'd like people to remember me as someone who was good at his job and a good guy too." And the next man on our list was cut from the same cloth: quiet, grounded, and deeply private, even as the world worshipped his face on every movie poster. Gary Cooper, the cowboy who stayed humble. To audiences, Gary Cooper was the ultimate American hero, stoic, tall, and calm under pressure. But off-screen, he was remarkably unassuming. Raised on a Montana ranch, Cooper never lost the sense of frontier modesty he'd grown up with. Even after becoming a household name in films like High Noon and Sergeant York, he kept to a quiet life, away from the cocktail circuits and press junkets. He preferred being outdoors, spending time with horses rather than hobnobbing with elites. When he wasn't working, Cooper was often found in jeans and a flannel shirt, helping with chores at his vacation property. His daughter once said that even when he received fan mail by the thousands, he still insisted on doing his own laundry. Cooper's humility wasn't an act. It was how he saw himself, a man doing a job, not a god on a pedestal. And as the industry grew louder and more chaotic, his quiet presence only became more valuable. Someone who shared that value, especially later in life, was a woman whose grace touched millions, but whose real passion lay not in spending, but in giving. Audrey Hepburn, elegant yet uninterested in wealth. Audrey Hepburn was the embodiment of timeless elegance, but behind the black dresses and pearls, she was perhaps the least materialistic star of her era. After surviving Nazi-occupied Holland during her youth, living through famine and hiding from soldiers, Hepburn never forgot what real suffering looked like. Even as breakfast at Tiffany's made her a fashion icon, she remained refreshingly down to earth. She donated millions to charity, most notably as a UNICEF ambassador. When she retired from film, Hepburn didn't buy villas in Paris or yachts in Monaco. She moved to a quiet village in Switzerland, where she grew vegetables and raised her children away from flashing cameras. Her humanitarian work became her second act, one fueled not by money, but by empathy. "As you grow older," she once said, "you will discover that you have two hands, one for helping yourself, the other for helping others." And no actor better embodied those working-class values than the man who spent his whole life staying exactly who he was: quiet, stoic, and serious about simplicity. Henry Fonda, the minimalist patriarch. Henry Fonda came from a small-town background, and he carried that no-frills attitude into every phase of his life. Known for powerful roles in films like 12 Angry Men and The Grapes of Wrath, Fonda never let success define him. He wasn't interested in glitz. He cared more about integrity, both on-screen and off. While others were splurging on sports cars and designer suits, Fonda drove a practical sedan and wore basic slacks and button-downs. Even at the height of his fame, he could often be found doing his own yard work or fixing things around the house. Friends described him as intensely private, not cold, but deeply guarded. His children, Peter and Jane Fonda, both became stars themselves, but even they admitted their father lived like a man who didn't care about money. He once said, "I hope people will say I did something worthwhile, that I was honest." From Henry Fonda's spare lifestyle, we move next to a woman who, despite achieving global fame, walked away from it all to chase something more meaningful. Ingrid Bergman, the actress who left it all behind. At the peak of her stardom, Ingrid Bergman walked away from it all. And not with a scandal, though that would come too, but with quiet resolve. She had taken Hollywood by storm with performances in classics like Casablanca and Gaslight, becoming one of the most admired and bankable actresses of the 1940s. But unlike many of her peers, Bergman had no desire to bask in the Hollywood glow forever. Fame wasn't a finish line for her. It was a stage she could leave when the applause didn't feel right anymore. In 1950, everything changed. While married, she fell in love with Italian director Roberto Rossellini. Their affair, and later their child out of wedlock, sent shockwaves through conservative post-war America. Public backlash was swift and brutal. Bergman was denounced on the floor of the U.S. Senate. Offers dried up. Her name vanished from studio marquees. But Ingrid didn't fight to come back. She embraced exile. She moved to Europe and lived simply in Italy and Sweden, often far from the cameras. Her homes were modest, her lifestyle stripped down. She cooked, walked her dog, and lived for her children. She returned to acting years later, but her choices were never driven by a hunger for the spotlight. They were artistic, deliberate, and deeply human. "I've gone from saint to whore and back to saint again, all in one lifetime," she once said. And in doing so, she taught the world something else. That personal freedom, not fame, is the real luxury. And speaking of women who rejected the Hollywood system on their own terms, the next actress on our list never needed diamonds or scandal to shine. Only intelligence, integrity, and the courage to stay off the red carpet. Myrna Loy, Hollywood's perfect wife, who hated flashiness. Myrna Loy didn't just play the wise, witty wife on screen. She lived like one in real life, grounded, elegant, and completely uninterested in the trappings of fame. While others posed in fur coats and jewels, Loy was busy organizing civil rights fundraisers, penning letters to senators, and tending to her garden. She rose to fame in the 1930s and 1940s, especially in the Thin Man series opposite William Powell, but she always resisted being swallowed by Hollywood's seductive excess. Her house was simple and cozy. She drove a practical car. Her closets weren't filled with designer gowns, but with clean, comfortable clothes she'd worn for years. She preferred a dinner at home to any red carpet gala. But what made her truly different wasn't just what she owned. It was what she stood for. Loy was outspoken about racism and injustice in an era when that could cost you work. She famously refused roles that demeaned women or perpetuated stereotypes. She wasn't afraid to walk away from a paycheck if it meant keeping her integrity. Hollywood adored her, but it never owned her. Myrna Loy proved you could be beloved without being extravagant, and you could be respected without playing the game. And if Loy was the poised moral compass of her time, the next man on our list was the rough-edged rebel, a star who never cared what anyone thought of his lifestyle, even as his fame exploded. Humphrey Bogart, a star who stayed salty. Humphrey Bogart had a face built for the shadows, the perfect noir anti-hero. Off-screen, he carried that same brooding honesty. As one of Hollywood's most enduring legends, Bogart made millions, but lived like he didn't trust the money to last. He didn't live in towering mansions or host champagne-soaked galas. He didn't wear flashy suits or flaunt his stardom. Bogart loved dive bars, backroom poker games, and sailing his modest yacht. While others retreated to Beverly Hills, Bogey kept company with regular guys, stagehands, bartenders, screenwriters. He'd sit for hours smoking and talking, usually in worn shoes and a wrinkled jacket. He was a star who never became a snob. "I don't trust people who don't drink," he once famously quipped, and he lived that mantra unapologetically. But there was more to Bogart than whiskey and rebellion. He fiercely supported the underdog, stood up for blacklisted writers during the McCarthy era, and called out Hollywood hypocrisy even when it put his career at risk. His relationship with Lauren Bacall only deepened his groundedness. Together, they weren't a glamorous power couple so much as two smart, sharp souls who liked the quiet as much as the stage. When Bogart died, Bacall didn't retreat into wealth. She followed his lead and his values. And that's where we go next, to a woman who shared Bogart's instincts for privacy, honesty, and a life lived far from the noise of fame. Lauren Bacall, old money, old values. Lauren Bacall had the cheekbones of a goddess and the voice of a jazz song at midnight. But behind the smoldering eyes and sultry screen persona was a woman shaped by dignity, not drama. After Bogart's death in 1957, Bacall stepped away from the social whirl and into something far quieter, an apartment on Manhattan's Upper West Side, where she'd live for the rest of her life. She wasn't poor by any stretch, but Bacall lived like someone who didn't need to prove anything. She cooked her own meals, raised her children without a battalion of nannies, and turned down glitzy roles that didn't align with her standards. She gave lectures, wrote memoirs, and walked her own dog in Central Park. She often turned down interviews and rarely made public appearances unless they meant something. And when asked about wealth, she once said, "You learn to keep your mouth shut and your checkbook closed." Bacall's elegance came from restraint. She didn't live in the past or cling to her old fame. She aged with grace and left behind a legacy of self-respect, something more lasting than any award. But not everyone in Hollywood chose modesty out of values. Some chose it because wealth couldn't soothe the ghosts they carried. And that brings us to the man who, for all his brilliance, lived like someone weighed down by the cost of stardom. Spencer Tracy. Money couldn't buy happiness. Spencer Tracy was a man of contradictions. Brilliant and brooding, funny and deeply private. One of the greatest actors of his generation, he gave unforgettable performances in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner and Captain's Courageous. But even at the height of his power, Tracy lived like a man haunted by something he couldn't fix. He often stayed in small hotel rooms while filming, even when a mansion was available. He ate simple meals, wore unremarkable clothes, and avoided flashy displays. Friends said he hated being fussed over. Fame embarrassed him. And for all his acclaim, Tracy never really believed in his own legend. He struggled with alcoholism for most of his life, and it often left him emotionally raw, even when his performances were flawless. His long private affair with Katharine Hepburn brought him comfort, but even she admitted he remained an island, unreachable at times. When asked about money, Tracy said it was a tool, not a goal. He worked to work, not to live richly. And in the end, despite his demons, his simplicity made him one of the most relatable stars of old Hollywood. As we move forward to the final chapter of our list, we'll meet a star who never chased the spotlight, because she was too busy chasing peace, love, and a quiet life, far from the cameras. Deborah Kerr, the British star who retired to modesty. Deborah Kerr had the face of nobility and the grace of a stage veteran. But when she walked away from Hollywood, she did so without a second glance. After a long and celebrated career that included The King and I and From Here to Eternity, Kerr turned her back on the noise and clamor of the spotlight and settled into a quiet life in Switzerland. She lived in a modest lakeside cottage with her husband, screenwriter Peter Viertel, far removed from the glimmering hills of Beverly. Kerr didn't host parties, didn't give tell-all interviews, and didn't stage a comeback. Her post-Hollywood years were spent gardening, reading, and enjoying the company of a few close friends. She valued peace over praise and presence over press. And while her name never left the lips of cinephiles, Kerr never seemed to care if the rest of the world remembered. She once said, "The trouble with Hollywood is that it starts by giving you everything you want, and then it wants everything in return." So she gave it her best performances, and then she left with her soul intact. And if Kerr was the lady who faded into the mist with dignity, our next star was the king of Hollywood, but one who still preferred boots to tuxedos. Clark Gable, king of Hollywood, yet so frugal. Clark Gable was every inch the American leading man, broad-shouldered, silver-tongued, and effortlessly cool. Yet, beneath all the fame that came with Gone with the Wind and It Happened One Night, Gable remained deeply frugal and unimpressed by luxury. He grew up working class in rural Ohio, and no amount of stardom could erase the instincts that upbringing gave him. He bought a ranch north of Los Angeles and spent most of his downtime working the land himself. He wore old jeans and flannel shirts. He drove trucks instead of town cars. On set, he'd show up early, stay late, and eat lunch with the crew. Not because it was performative, but because that's who he was. He hated pretense. Friends would often joke that if Gable weren't the biggest star in the world, he'd probably be just as happy fixing fences and riding horses. And they were right, because for Gable, fame was a job, not an identity. He once said, "I'm just a lucky slob from Ohio who happened to be in the right place at the right time." That humility never left him, and neither did it leave the child star who took the world by storm, only to retreat into politics, family, and an unassuming life far from the lens. Shirley Temple, child star turned practical diplomat. Shirley Temple was the face of hope during the Great Depression. A curly-haired dynamo who sang, danced, and smiled her way into the hearts of millions. But while the world saw her as America's sweetheart, Shirley herself never let stardom inflate her sense of self-worth. She was grounded from the start, thanks in part to parents who tightly managed her earnings, and in part to her own astonishing maturity. When the lights of Hollywood started to fade, Shirley didn't chase them. She walked away from acting in her early 20s and never looked back. Instead, she pursued public service. She became a respected diplomat, serving as the U.S. ambassador to Ghana and later Czechoslovakia, a job she took more seriously than any role she ever played. At home in California, She lived in a comfortable but unpretentious house. She dressed simply, raised her children quietly, and saved money like someone who had known what it meant to lose it. Despite being one of the richest child actors of all time, Shirley was never flashy. "Good luck needs no explanation," she once said, and neither did her graceful exit from the spotlight. Which brings us to another woman who, though born into fame and fortune, found serenity not in the hills of Los Angeles, but in the quiet corners of Europe, far from the chaos she once commanded. Olivia de Havilland, old Hollywood royalty in quiet Paris. If Olivia de Havilland had stayed in Hollywood, she could have lived like a queen. After all, she'd already played one on screen. With 2 Academy Awards to her name and roles in iconic films like Gone with the Wind, she had every reason to lean into the high life. But instead, Olivia did something few actresses dared. She left. In the 1950s, she moved to Paris, not for the fashion or the lights, but for the calm. There, in a modest left-bank apartment, she lived the rest of her life largely outside of public view. No entourages, no excess. She rode the metro. She grocery shopped herself. She attended book readings and poetry salons. To the French, she was a quiet lady with poise. To the rest of the world, she remained the last living link to the golden era of Hollywood, but she never tried to capitalize on it. Her final interviews, given late in life, spoke more about peace, poetry, and dignity than films or fame. And that leads us to the final chapter. Not a single star, but a theme. A thread that ran through them all. A lesson more powerful than any box office hit. Lessons from Hollywood's humble legends. What ties all of these stars together isn't just their fame or their films. It's what they did when the curtain fell, when the applause faded, and the flashbulbs went dark. It's not the awards they won or the box office numbers they pulled. It's the quiet dignity with which they chose to live when no one was watching. These were men and women who had seen the summit of success and still craved something simpler, something real. They could have had anything: private jets, island homes, armies of assistants, and closets full of designer clothes. But instead, they chose used cars, handwritten letters, morning walks, and homemade dinners. They chose silence over spectacle, meaning over money. They understood something that still escapes so many today: that wealth, no matter how vast, can never buy inner peace. These were not people who never struggled. In fact, many of them came from nothing, children of poverty, war, and broken homes. They had scraped and suffered their way into stardom, only to realize that the true treasure wasn't fame. It was freedom. Freedom from chaos. Freedom from needing to prove anything to anyone. Some left the industry entirely, vanishing into the hills of Europe or the small towns of America. Others stayed, but on their own terms, rejecting roles that insulted their values, turning down offers that didn't feel right. They didn't sell their souls, they protected them. And in doing so, they protected something else: their legacy. They gave us more than unforgettable performances. They gave us quiet blueprints, maps that showed how to stay human in an industry built to turn people into products. They showed us that you can be iconic without being indulgent, powerful without being proud, famous without being flashy. They lived through war, through economic collapse, through scandal and reinvention. And through it all, they kept their feet on the ground and their eyes on something higher: integrity, authenticity, and peace. And now, long after they've left this world, their stories still whisper to us: live with grace, shine with humility, leave something behind that matters. In a world that continues to obsess over glitter and spectacle, where headlines value scandal more than substance, these legends remind us of something precious: that the brightest stars aren't always the loudest. Sometimes, they are the ones that simply and quietly endured. And maybe that's the greatest legacy of all.